Good morning to the analysts and participants joining us from this region, and those who are from Japan and Australia. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
On behalf of the Pathfinder Foundation, I welcome you to today's webinar. The new government charting the path for integration into the global economy. This timely discussion comes at a crucial juncture for Sri Lanka, as the recent parliamentary elections have marked the beginning of a new chapter under the leadership of President Anura Kumara Dissanayake. The resulting political stability is not just a milestone in governance, but a cornerstone for rebuilding trust within our nation and with the international community, paving the way for economic recovery and sustainable growth. I want to welcome the esteemed speakers and guests warmly. We are truly honored to have Professor Haruhiko Kuroda, former governor of the Bank of Japan, delivering today's keynote address. It is also a privilege to have Professor Premachandra Athukorala, a renowned economist from the Australian National University, as our lead presenter. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Gio Sagsain, country manager for Sri Lanka and Maldives in the World Bank, who will deliver the opening remarks. And Mr. Naoki Kamoshida, Deputy Head of the Japanese Embassy in Sri Lanka, as our guest speaker. I wish to express my heartfelt gratitude to Ambassador Nobuhito Obo, former Japanese ambassador in Sri Lanka and executive advisor to GRIPS Alliance, for his invaluable support in coordinating with us to make this event successful. Additionally, I sincerely thank Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, Distinguished Fellow at the Pathfinder Foundation and former Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, for his role as moderator and for introducing the webinar. We sincerely appreciate your presence and willingness to share your profound insights and expertise on this important topic with us today. The new government is making significant strides in its commitment to policy reforms, reaching staff-level agreements with the International Monetary Fund on the third review under the 4-year Extended Fund Facility Program, reflecting a steadfast dedication to fiscal discipline and structural transformation. These efforts reaffirm the government's resolve and inspire confidence among development partners and potential investors. Equally encouraging is the administration's focus on good governance, transparency, and accountability. The pledge to eliminate corruption and ensure impartiality in investment opportunities is a transformative shift that aims to create a fair, transparent, and competitive economic environment. These foundational measures are critical to attract much-needed foreign investment and fostering equitable growth across all sectors of society. However, as we traverse this path, we must also acknowledge the challenges ahead. Given the vast debt hangover, the need for acceleration of economic growth and policy reforms, and most importantly, a long-term vision, are vital for restoring the living standards of the middle-income households, alleviating poverty, and addressing economic vulnerability. Such reforms should focus on enhancing trade competitiveness and fostering innovation to secure a stronger position in global economy, Further, we should learn from our past experiences. A forward-looking nation, which was the first to embrace open market economy in South Asia nearly half a century ago, but unfortunately stagnated. While learning from our peers, we have made significant strides in integration into the global economy. Today's discussion are set to provide valuable insights into these areas with collective expertise of our esteemed panel. I am confident we will explore actionable strategies to strengthen Sri Lanka's integration into the global economy. Their perspectives will help us better understand how to attract robust investments, build resilient institutions, and drive sustainable growth. In closing, I would like to emphasize the importance of collaboration, partnerships with the international community and development agencies will be vital in achieving Sri Lanka's aspirations for sustainable development and long-term prosperity. Thank you for being part of this important dialogue. I wish you a productive and engaging session. Thank you. Now, may I request Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, Distinguished Fellow, Pathfinder Foundation, and former Governor of Central Bank, to make his introduction to the seminar and who will also function as moderator of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gunatilaka. Let me first say what a great privilege it is to participate in this seminar with such an eminent, absolutely stellar cast of speakers. So in terms of my role, I think I need to maximize the time for the speakers. I'll just make a few brief remarks by way of introduction. And what I would like to do is really say that if you look back at Sri Lanka's economic underperformance over now a few decades, one can identify two sets of challenges. The first is repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress. And the second is the inability to create a competitive, outward-looking growth model which provides sustained growth. These are really the two sets of problems the country has been confronted with. And to take stock on each of them, I think we have made significant progress on one. We have barely scratched the surface on the other. So in terms of addressing the problem of having repeated bouts of macroeconomic stability, if you look back, the root causes have invariably been unsustainable fiscal outcomes. And the excess aggregate demand pumped into the system through these unsustainable fiscal deficits have been amplified by fiscal dominance in monetary policy. And the two channels through which that dominance was perpetrated was deficit financing and also, secondly, financial repression, whereby the yield curve was artificially pulled down. And all of this really led to excess aggregate demand in the system with price pressure and balance of payments pressure. So these were repeating cycles. Sri Lanka had 17 IMF programs. And of course, some of those programs were necessitated by exogenous shock. But by and large, it was domestic macroeconomic policymaking that contributed most significantly to the unsustainability that repeatedly came. And often the unsustainability was linked to the electoral calendar. As elections approached, Lee Kuan Yew famously said that elections in Sri Lanka are auctions of non-existent resources. So that was really, I think, a very pithy description of what happened. So we had this going on again and again, but I think we have now entered a whole new paradigm. The two landmark bits of legislation, the Public Finance Management Act and the Central Bank Act, have now created very clear frameworks for macroeconomic management, and the rules have been tightened. With the fiscal outturn, which has been the main source of instability, there are now much tighter fiscal rules. There is a primary deficit target of 2.3% of GDP and a primary expenditure target of 13% of GDP. So there are very tight rules which should provided the law is abided by, which should prevent us from having this historical weakness of having repeating cycles of unsustainable fiscal outcomes. Equally, on the central bank side, the fiscal forbearance in monetary policy has been addressed by the new Central Bank Act, which gives the central bank greater autonomy as well as accountability. The autonomy has come by there being no treasury presence in the governance structures of the central bank anymore. Equally, the central bank cannot, by law, indulge in any deficit financing. And also, it is adopted a flexible inflation targeting regime as the regime for monetary policy formulation. So artificially bringing down the yield curve through putting caps on benchmark interest rates, etc., are no longer possible because you have this framework based on the flexible inflation targeting, which is a data-driven, forward-looking regime of monetary policy formulation. So these kind of weaknesses in our macroeconomic policy making that have repeatedly put us into unsustainable macroeconomic situations should not be repeated. The law does not permit you to repeat it. If, of course, the law can be changed at any time. If there are efforts to change the law, in my view, that would be a very clear signal, red light that it should be flashing if that happens, because then we could well go back to our old ways. But now, for the moment, we have a new paradigm as for macroeconomic policy making, which should enable us to put these repeating cycles of macro instability behind. Of course, there could be exogenous shocks. There's nothing we can do about that, and we would need to adjust to that. And we need to build up buffers in the system to be able to cope with that. But the domestic policy mistakes should now be reduced significantly. The other challenge is the creation of this growth model, which is outward-looking and competitive. There, we have not made any progress. And this is where I think our deliberations today should focus on, because if you look at what has happened, we have regressed. In 2000, in the year 2000, the exports of goods and services as a percent of GDP amounted to about 35%. Today, it has come down to about 17 or 18%. So it is almost half. So we've gone backwards. The level of protection has been higher. We've got non-tariff barriers, which have served to exclude us from international supply chains. So all these things now need to be addressed. We have barely started, but there now needs to be a laser-like focus really on building a growth model that is based on export transformation. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of people have done this successfully. Professor Atkurali, I know, is an expert on this. I'm sure it'd be very good to hear from him. And also it'd be very good to get a multilateral input from Mr. Saxian. And the final point I want to make is the role of Japan. Japan was Sri Lanka's most generous bilateral donor for many years. And I think Sri Lanka, as it comes out of its very severe crisis, if it is to achieve the kind of levels of growth that it needs to have, would need the assistance of all its development partners. And Japan has been a notable development partner all along and has an important role to play, I think, in helping Sri Lanka to achieve the 5% plus growth rate that it has to achieve. One, to address the serious deterioration in poverty in the country. There's been a doubling of income poverty. To address poverty, the deterioration in poverty, and also to make sure that by 2027, 28, we do not have to go for another debt restructuring, because it's a tight program that has been put in place in terms of getting out of our debt stress. And I think to be sure that we get over that period, by 2027, 28, we need to have sufficient growth in the economy for us to be able to, one, start servicing all our debt, and also to finance our import bill. So that would not be possible without having growth of more than 5%. And that can only be achieved by an outward-looking strategy where export transformation is at the heart of it. Thank you very much. So,
Thank you, Dr. Kumaraswamy. May I now request Mr. Jivo Sagsay, Country Manager for Sri Lanka and Maldives, World Bank, to address the gathering. You have 10 minutes for your presentation. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Bernard Gunetileke. Also my very good friend, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy. Distinguished speakers, participants online, fellows of the Pathfinder Foundation, very, very good morning to all of you. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person, present. I would love to be there, but I'm traveling right now. But I'm sure that we will have many other opportunities to interact also in person. I'm really, really thrilled to be part of this distinguished group and contribute to the brainstorming on what the country can and should do to avoid the pitfalls. And I would like really to extend my sincere thanks to the Pathfinder Foundation for inviting me to open this important webinar. Today's theme, charting Sri Lanka's path for integration into the economy, is highly relevant, as previous speakers already indicated, and I'm pleased to share some of my thoughts on behalf of the also World Bank Group and as a partner in Sri Lanka's development journey. Again, we all know that the Sri Lanka's political landscape underwent a significant shift with the elections of the new government last year. The confidence and trust placed by the people in President Anurakumara Dissanayaka's current administration was evident in its remarkable two-time election victory. This trust brings high expectations for a transformed Sri Lanka, socially, politically, and economically. The country's economic stability has been hard-earned, as already was mentioned, through 2 years of ambitious reforms and debt restructuring. Although the economy has stabilized the new government has pledged its commitment to its continuation of the reform program, the crisis has left scarring impacts on the nation. Small businesses and vulnerable groups have especially suffered due to high living costs and job losses, while brain drain and skill migration have reached soaring heights. Unbelievable, but food insecurity still remains a challenge, while poverty, as already was mentioned, nearly doubled since 2021. We are now at about 26% based on 2023 data. The government's promise to resolve these issues offer hope, and if implemented with accuracy, will stamp a sense of social as well as political stability in the country. Importantly, I think the elections of the new government marks the first time that Sri Lanka's vote was not driven by ethno-religious sentiments, resulting in an unprecedented and nationally unifying victory for the ruling party. Now, this alone is evidence of the broad-based backing of the people and provides the best license to exercise fair, inclusive, and corruption-free governance, whilst elevating living standards as promised during pre-election campaigns and post-election. But it also provides license to take tough, difficult decisions, which are going to be absolutely critical to address the challenges. The good governance undertaking was further bolstered with the launch of the Clean Sri Lanka program or project on the first day of the new year. I actually had the privilege of receiving an invitation for this launch and found the formulated vision quite promising. Now, in the nutshell, we have a government with a very high legitimacy and a broad-based support, but facing an immense pressure of high, I would say often unrealistic expectations in the context when fiscal space is severely constrained and the maneuvering room for monetary policies is also limited. To retain the level of support it enjoys now, I think it will be important to show rapid results and have some quick wins while implementing longer-term investment programs and structural reforms. So I'd like in that context prioritize two areas. They are intertwined and interlinked, in my opinion. The first one is about revenue mobilization. The tax revenues have picked up significantly from a low 7% of GDP in 2022 to an estimated 11.9, I believe, the latest data that we have for 2024. Yet this remains still a low ratio compared to other peers. You would expect these countries to be closer to 20%. But in addition to that, the burden sharing has been extremely unequal. More than 2/3 of revenue comes from indirect taxes like VAT, which is regressive. It does hurt the poor. Similarly, a very small segment of businesses shoulders disproportionate burden of taxes, while tax evasion is widespread. We have estimated that about 3%, at least 3% of GDP in additional revenues can be generated by 2027 through reducing tax exemptions, which haven't been shown to have any material impact on economic growth or boost of investments. Second, by improved tax administration with a strong emphasis on using digitalization. And third, on improving tax morale. Again, I want to emphasize that at least 3% increase of GDP revenues can be achieved without any additional tax burden. In other words, no tax rates will need to be raised for that matter. Now, the second one, and it's very much going to the heart of the objective of this discussion, but as I already said, I think these two aspects are very interlinked, is bolstering growth. Now, Sri Lanka has got, again, as already was mentioned, Sri Lanka has got a breathing space for a few years until debt services restarts. So unless rapid and sustained growth is achieved in a few years, unless this rapid growth is achieved in a few years, the debt to GDP will stay at about 90%, taking close to 50% of the budget revenues for debt servicing, leaving very little space for social and economic programs, which population expects and which, of course, this government promised to deliver. And as I mentioned earlier, the fiscal space for public investments to generate growth is extremely limited. So in other words, what was done in some countries like Vietnam or China through massive public investments is not feasible in the Sri Lankan context because of the factors that we have been discussing. So the growth will have to be private sector led, predominantly, if not exclusively. And already both speakers before me mentioned that, both Dr. Indrajit and Ambassador, that for the last 2 decades, we have seen FDI hovering at about 1% of GDP. Again, most of that, if you look at even that 1%, went into largely real estate rather than the productive investment, compared to about 5% in countries like Vietnam. And this is not a single year or a few years. This is a trend that has been going on for about 10 to 20 years. The other aspect is trade. Again, you know better than I, trade has helped to lift out of poverty hundreds of millions in Asia. And indeed, you mentioned already that Sri Lanka's relationship with trade is not new. Historically known as Serendip, it was a trade hub and was globally recognized in 60s and 70s for its competitiveness in manufacturing and value-added products. However, Sri Lanka has lost significant ground, right? Again, repeating the numbers, but I think it is important that today it's one of the most protected economies in the world. The inward turn over the past 2 decades with trade barriers has led to a diminished role of trade in GDP, and the export has largely collapsed. It got, as Dr. Indrajit mentioned already, it got basically collapsed by about 50%, from 35 to 40% to about 15 to 80% in 2020. Engaging further with the global economy could help speed up economic recovery. Now, Sri Lanka offers significant investment potential, particularly in tourism, energy, agriculture, IT, digital sectors. So opening up the economy to trade will be key to attracting foreign direct investment and boosting Sri Lanka's growth prospects, as well as charting the path for integration into global economy. The potential for successful diversification and expansion of exports requires liberalized trade and a better investment climate to increase the competitiveness, export orientation of the economy. Sri Lanka's untapped export potential of around 10 billion annually would be vital in creating jobs and boosting incomes. Again, this 10 billion is something we estimated recently. We also estimated that this could be twice of the current level, with a capacity to create of at least additional 140,000 jobs, especially in value-added agriculture and manufacturing exports. In the current context, Sri Lanka has a considerable opportunity to capitalize on shifts in global value chains due to geopolitical challenges and changes that are happening and supply chain disruptions. Significantly, Sri Lanka also boasts one of the largest ports in dynamic and economic region, is next to the largest economic powerhouses in the world. This offers a gateway for a robust engagement with the global economy, and by tapping into the regional and global value chains, the country can speed up economic recovery, create jobs, and generate significant foreign exchange inflows. This will also result in significant increase of revenues for the budget, making debt servicing more affordable and allowing the government to deliver on its ambitious promise. To capitalize on the new opportunities, Sri Lanka's trade policy should focus on reducing tariffs, implementing a national single window, something that has been talked about for many years, yet hasn't been done, and to reduce trade costs, adopting a modern FDI regime, and establishing complementary labor market policies. Again, those are not any novel ideas. These are well-tested ideas that definitely will have impact, but what it requires is political will. Given Sri Lanka's recent history of poor economic governance, especially with reform reversals, fragmented policy making, and frequent policy changes, a consistent program of priority structural reforms aimed at spurring exports, FDI, and productivity growth is critical to ensure credibility and enhance the initial confidence of the private sector. These measures will increase the competitiveness and export orientation of the economy and make Sri Lanka a more attractive location for companies looking to diversify their sourcing strategies. Many of these measures can be quick wins, as they do not require major investments, but they require strong political will. So as development partners, our role is in facilitating the nascent recovery, involves making strategic investments in critical sectors and providing the kind of policy guidance, support, and advice that fosters sustainable growth. To that end, we at the World Bank Group are currently updating our strategy, what we call country partnership framework, to align with the government's priorities to support growth-enhancing reforms and investments as the economy stabilizes. So in the summary, Sri Lanka has elected a government which enjoys an unprecedented confidence and trust. But the population expectations for change, for improvement of quality of lives, are extremely high in the environment where the fiscal space is severely constrained. And the breathing space due to debt restructuring is also limited. I genuinely believe that the only way to meet public expectations and raise revenues for debt service and delivering on social and economic promises is through a sustainable private sector-led growth, requiring better investment climate and liberalized trade policies. The country has an opportunity to leverage its traditional strengths, geography, and skills as a trading hub and build high-value export-oriented economy. Many of these solutions do not require significant investments and can be quick wins, which is important for sustaining confidence of the public and businesses. The World Bank Group is committed to supporting the government and other stakeholders in this, what I think is a historic journey. Again, thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saxena, for your presentation. Very useful beginning for our work. With that, may I invite Mr. Kamoshida Naoki, Deputy Head of Mission, Embassy of Japan.
I just realized my video was all off when I was speaking. I'm really sorry. I just only turned it on.
No problem. It's fine. Thank you.
No, we could hear properly.
I do very clearly, yeah.
Yeah, but video was clearly off. Sorry, Zoom is not what we use regularly, and that's why I kind of did not spot it.
No issue. Thank you. Mr. Naoki?
Yes, we thank Ambassador, eminent speakers, distinguished guests and participants, chairman and members of Pathfinder Foundation, ladies and gentlemen. Honor and privilege to speak today on behalf of the Embassy of Japan in Sri Lanka in this important seminar organized by Pathfinder Foundation. And thank you very much for inviting me to join the panel. This seminar provides a good opportunity to discuss Sri Lanka's economic prospects under the new government and the role of international partners, including Japan. As was already mentioned by previous speakers, the presidential election and the general elections in 2024 have brought about significant changes in Sri Lanka's political landscape. The commitment of the new administration to upholding the rule of law, enhancing transparency, and eradicating corruption is indeed commendable. Specific initiatives have already started, like the digitalization of government services to reduce bureaucratic inefficiencies and stringent measures against corruption. These actions could serve as tangible steps towards restoring public trust and fostering a culture of accountability. These reforms are critical not only for restoring public confidence, but also for rebuilding trust among the international community. However, it is yet to be seen whether the new government is capable enough to carry through these reforms and bring their vision into reality. So I sincerely hope that the new administration will fulfill its promises for good governance through concrete actions. Japan has always been a steadfast partner in Sri Lanka's development journey. Over the decades, Japan has extended significant support through its official development assistance, including concessional yen loans, grants, and technical cooperation. Japan extended active assistance for both developing vital infrastructure, for instance, the international airport and the Southern Expressway, as well as building human capacity in various sectors such as education, healthcare, and disaster management. Our partnership is rooted in mutual respect and a shared vision of sustainable development. If we look back following the unprecedented economic crisis of 2022, Japan provided nearly $100 million in emergency humanitarian assistance. And furthermore, in response to Sri Lanka's efforts for debt restructuring, Japan, in collaboration with France and India, took the lead in establishing the official creditor committee in April 2023. This initiative culminated in the signing of a memorandum of understanding on debt restructuring between the official creditor committee countries and the Sri Lankan government in July last year. And immediately following that, Japan resumed disbursement for 11 yen loan projects, becoming the first country to restart disbursement of bilateral concessional financing. This shows how strong our historic friendship is and how important Japan regards its partnership with Sri Lanka. We remain committed to supporting Sri Lanka's full economic recovery. As mentioned in the previous discussion, Sri Lanka today stands at the critical crossroads. It is encouraging to see very recent economic indicators such as positive GDP growth rate, stable inflation rate, and increased foreign reserves. The successful debt restructuring agreement with public creditors and the following completion of debt restructuring with international sovereign bond holders are positive developments. The upgrades in Sri Lanka's credit ratings by rating agencies like Moody's and Fitch signal the move out of default, and they are welcome milestones which enhance the credibility of the country in the international community. The macroeconomic policies in line with the IMF program, which were started by the previous government and continue to be observed by the current government, are beginning to bear fruits. It is indeed encouraging to see the new administration continue these policies. The quick, successful conclusion of the staff-level agreement with the IMF on the third review under the extended fund facility sent a good signal to the financial market, demonstrating the new government's resolve to pursue sound macroeconomic management and structural reforms. However, it is yet to be seen whether the government could continue to take a narrow path, which enables them to maintain fiscal discipline while living up to the high expectations of the general public at the same time. Furthermore, maintaining fiscal and macroeconomic stability is only the beginning, as I mentioned in the beginning of today's panel discussion. The real challenge lies in moving beyond stabilization to achieving sustainable growth to address income disparities and reduce poverty. Japan's support for Sri Lanka will remain unwavering. Having said that, the extent and effectiveness of our collaboration will partly depend on the government's ability to maintain momentum in its reform agenda. By continuing to implement IMF-backed policies, fostering transparency, and ensuring a stable and predictable business environment, Sri Lanka can regain the confidence of the international community. And this will, in turn, unlock further development assistance and encourage much-needed foreign direct investment. It is important to note that resources from the public sector alone are far from sufficient to drive a country's economic growth. And as our World Bank colleagues pointed out, mobilization of private funds is crucial. Furthermore, we should not underestimate the transformative potential of foreign direct investment. Private investments bring not only capital, but also technology, expertise, and access to global markets. For a country like Sri Lanka, which is limited in size of its domestic market, deepening its integration into the global economy is essential for sustained economic growth. This requires strategic initiatives to diversify the economy, enhance exports, and create a trade regime that is both competitive and inclusive. At the same time, governance reforms are indispensable. Efficient and accountable institutions are the backbone of sustainable development. The consistent enforcement of laws and transparent rules and procedures will create an environment where businesses can thrive. Visible progress in combating corruption, the priority of the president, will be crucial. Foreign investors, including Japanese companies, are carefully watching how the business environment will be improved under the new government. Japan has been helping the Commission for investigating bribery or corruption to digitalize its work and prepare a new national action plan. And we are helping this in collaboration with the UNDP. And also Japan has been cooperating with other donors in Sri Lanka's electricity sector reform. We would like to continue to work with the Sri Lankan government to actively pursue governance reforms to improve the country's investment climate. It is also important that the country has a clear strategic plan for its long-term development. Japan's experience as a developmental partner underscores the importance of aligning assistance with the country's long-term strategies. We believe that Sri Lanka's success lies in leveraging its unique geographic location, rich cultural heritage, and skilled workforce in order to become a hub for trade and investment in the Indian Ocean region. It is vital for Sri Lanka to make the most of this strategic geographical advantage. The country needs to identify the source of economic growth and make necessary investment. With the right policy and partnerships, Sri Lanka can achieve this vision. As Sri Lanka embarks on this journey, Japan stands ready to assist. Whether through continued financial support, capacity building, or knowledge sharing, we are committed to being a reliable partner in Sri Lanka's pursuit of economic growth. In conclusion, I wish to emphasize that the path to recovery and growth requires vision, perseverance, and collaboration. By embracing reforms and fostering trust with international partners, Sri Lanka can not only overcome its current challenges, but also pave the way for a brighter, more prosperous future. Together, let us work towards realizing this shared aspiration. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. That was our guest speaker, Mr. Kamoshida. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Haruhiko Kuroda, former governor of the Bank of Japan, our keynote speaker, to take the floor. Professor, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. When Sri Lanka became independent from the UK in 1948, with the significant exports of cinnamon, rubber, and Ceylon tea, its per capita GDP was several times larger than India's. Even in 2023, Sri Lanka's per capita GDP was close to 4,000 US dollars and nearly double of India's 2,200 US dollars. However, Sri Lanka had the 26-year-long civil war in 1983 to 2009, during which time its economy fluctuated widely between negative growth in 1992, 98, and 2001, and double-digit growth in 1991, 95, and 97, growing on average about 5%. After the end of civil war, the Sri Lankan economy grew by around 6%, but then the 2019 Sri Lanka Easter bombing made flourishing tourism to stall and the economy to stagnate. The Sri Lankan government made a big tax cut, which worsened the fiscal situation without much reviving the economy. The government also promoted organic farming with a ban on chemical fertilizers, which significantly reduced tea and other agricultural production, making the country short of foreign exchanges and impossible to import necessary energy resources. The economy continued to fluctuate and at the same time stagnate. For instance, growing minus 4.6% in 2020, positive 6% in 2021, and minus negative 7.4% in 2022. And the government defaulted in May 2022, and the IMF decided to provide $3 billion under the EFF to Sri Lanka in September 2022, on the condition that its primary surplus be 2.3% of GDP, and debt GDP ratio be reduced from the current 115% to 95% by 2032. At the same time, the IMF program necessitated the central bank to be given greater independence, prohibiting monetary finance of the treasury. The Sri Lankan rupee was also floated, resulting in more worker remittances and export earnings coming to Sri Lanka, helping the current account balance. So in order to make the Sri Lankan economy to develop and grow, the government must face and overcome the following 4 challenges. First, the government must increase its revenue from the current 8% of GDP in 2022 to 15% of GDP by 2025, as the IMF program recommends. At the same time, it must strengthen public policy management and create transparency in public procurement. Second, with realistic exchange rates and agricultural policy, as well as liberal trade policy, exports of agricultural products such as tea, as well as textiles and garments, be increased, making imports of necessary energy and capital goods possible. Third, the government should privatize state-owned enterprises so as to make them develop and grow faster, and to contribute to the Sri Lankan economy becoming stronger and more robust. Fourth, the government must continue its efforts for debt negotiation with creditor countries such as China, India, and Japan, so as to make external debt sustainable. Since India is the most important trading partner for Sri Lanka, it must establish stable and reliable relationship with India. I really think that the current government, with the majority in the parliament, should and can make decisive actions for the Sri Lankan economy and society to further develop and improve living standard of the people in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. Now, we would like to invite our lead presenter, Professor Premachandra Athukorala, Professor of Economics, was attached to the Australian National University in Canberra, to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuntilaka. Thank you and Dr. Daya Silva for the opportunity to participate in this excellent policy forum. It's a great pleasure for me to join other panelists, including Koroda Sensei. And I very much like the opportunity of having my good friend, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, as the moderator of my presentation. Let me start with my PowerPoint presentation. It seems that you are not allowed. I'm not allowed to use the PowerPoint from your
share.
side.
You can share now, Professor.
You can share now, Professor?
Yeah. Can you see now?
Yes.
Yes, I can see.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, as Dr. Kumaraswamy mentioned in his opening remarks, Sri Lanka has been a repetitive client of the IMF. We have gone there before 16 times. Out of these 16 agreements, we completed 11 of them. The other ones went halfway through. And however, this crisis is unique. We need to understand it clearly. Previous cases were simply liquidity crisis. We entered mostly into standby agreement. Once the agreement is finished, sometimes tweaking macroeconomic data, we got back to the previous practice of fiscal and monetary profligacy. But we can't do it this time. This time, it is not a liquidity crisis, but a solvency crisis. We went to the IMF after defaulting a huge debt overhang. At the same time, most important point we have to keep it in mind is that debt overhang was underpinned by a massive anti-tradable bias, as Dr. Kumaraswamy mentioned initially. I want to show this figure. The reform started in 1977, even though the reforms were incomplete and half-hearted. And again, as Professor Koroda mentioned, there was a civil war going in for 3 decades. Still, we achieved some significant economic gain. Our export to GDP ratio increased from actually in the 60s, it was less than 10%. It increased closer to 35% during this period. And then tradable share in GDP also increased. In a separate slide, I have defined tradables and non-tradables. I think I don't have to go into detail. That means the portion of GDP exposed to foreign trade is basically, we call it tradable production. Actually, that's where the growth dynamism lies. Non-traded sector growth depend on domestic demand supply factors. Therefore, dynamic growth has to come from tradable, as it has happened in Japan, as well as in dynamic East Asian countries, including China. Now, what happened from about mid 2010, particularly after ending of the civil war, was a the trade to GDP ratio, export to GDP ratio in particular, plummeting to a level of about 14%. Now, that structural misalignment was the source of country succumbing to the debt crisis and becoming default among Asian countries over the last, no country in Asia has defaulted debt over the last 30 years. We became the first country to default debt, and it created a huge burden of debt restructuring, in addition to economic stabilization effort. Now, in this context, to place the economy on a sustainable growth path beyond the crisis, it is necessary to combine macroeconomic stabilization under the IMF program with a systematic structural adjustment reform to redress the anti-tradable bias. In other words, to restructure our production in order to shift from non-tradable production toward tradable production. By tradable production, I do not simply mean export-oriented production. Efficient import substitution production is equally important. And again, when it comes to export orientation, many people focus only on manufacturing. But we have equally important opportunities in the agricultural sector in order to diversify into high-value agricultural product. According to my research, when you analyze disaggregated trade data, actually the most rapidly expanding segment is not manufacturing, but high-value processed food. In that area, we have ample opportunities as well. Now, to set the stage for my policy discussion, I want to say a few things about the structural adjustment scenario of the IMF Extended Fund Facility Program. Now, the EFF program has so far focused on stabilizing the economy and helping the country to re-enter world capital market. The early premise of the EFF package to add structural adjustment component to the program has not yet happened, but government has to take into account to fill that gap. Economic stabilization through fiscal consolidation and contraction of monetary policy is the prime focus of the program. It is essential for economic recovery, but it is not sufficient. This program is based on the standard twin deficit approach to economic stabilization, or the so-called Pollack model, which postulates a unidirectional relationship between budget deficit and the balance of payment deficit. There is no evidence from many developing countries as well as from Sri Lanka to strongly support this view. According to my ongoing research, when I allow external factors impacting on the balance of payment situation and countries' policy backsliding relating to trade reform and the FDI regime, which became utterly corrupt over the last 10 years, when you allow for this, the correlation between current account deficit and the budget deficit is not less than 0.5%, the coefficient. We need to take this into account in our discussion. Now, I have put together data here for 2019, the year before the onset of the crisis, and the latest year for which we have data, which is 2023, and the IMF forecast coming from the second review, which was issued in mid-2024, I think, but this third review might be slightly different. But my view is that when it comes to debt-related data, actually the situation can be slightly even bad, simply because our debt structuring process, even though it has completed, initially IMF expected a substantial debt relief, but it has not come through. At most, total cut in the face value of the debt is going to be only about 2.5 billion, right? When you allow for that, the debt figures can be even a little bit on the higher side. I'm not quite sure. But look at the data. Total debt to GDP ratio is bound to increase from pre-crisis year to over 89% of GDP to over 106. And then interest payment as a percentage of government revenue had increased to 80% in 2022 to 23. And remember, this has happened in a context where external debt service ratio has declined simply because we are not repaying debt because of the initial debt moratorium, which has been accepted or formalized under the debt restructuring process. External debt servicing ratio, that's mean the sum of debt amortization and interest payment as a percentage of export earning had declined from 29% to about 15%. And this is a component in the government debt. But even with that decline on the foreign debt side, actually interest payment as a percentage of government revenue has increased from 48% to 80%, simply because during this period there has been heavy borrowing in the domestic capital market, from domestic sources. But more important aspect relating to structural adjustment is the external debt component. External debt accounts for more than half or closer to 60% of Sri Lanka's total debt. In terms of as a percentage of GDP, external debt is now about 65%. It is predicted to increase to about 68%. I think the figure is going to be much higher simply because IMF initial expectation of debt reduction through the debt restructuring process has not materialized. It can be higher. However, external debt to GDP ratio is a misleading indicator of the debt burden simply because GDP, the denominator, has a huge non-tradable component, right? The non-tradable production does not directly enable the country's debt repayment capability. The best indicator used by sensible economists, including the late Don Bush and John Williamson, Carlos F. Trias, Alejandro, is not external debt to GDP ratio, but external debt to export ratio. Sri Lanka has by far the highest external debt to export ratio in the world. It was 339 in 2019. It is predicted to increase to about 417. There can be changes with export expansion and so on, but even then, Sri Lanka is going to have by far the highest external debt to export ratio in the world. Now, when you look at the fiscal side, we are expecting to increase the primary budget balance, which is the budget deficit excluding interest payment, which is the better indicator of debt servicing capability. That is going to be only 2.3% by 2027. However, according to my calculations, assuming a modest interest rate of 8%, I'm sure it is going to be higher, total debt interest payment alone as a percentage of GDP is going to be about 4.5%, which is well above the predicted primary budget deficit. At the same time, when it comes to repaying external debt, actually having a government surplus itself is not enough, simply because Sri Lanka's foreign debt is entirely dollar or yen denominated. Not only we have to convert, create a primary surplus, but we have to convert this into foreign currency. If the balance of payment does not improve, actually this conversion process is going to lead to further exchange rate depreciation. And the debt burden in terms of rupees is going to be much higher. I have summarized this point in these slides, but in order to save time, I am going to move based on this basic discussion to policy challenge the government face beyond the extended fund facility program. Given the huge debt overhang with a large share of foreign debt, beyond the IMF program, Sri Lanka faces twin challenges. These are firstly payment problem or the payment challenge, that means creating a primary surplus. Then to use the standard Keynesian terms, we have the transfer problem. You have to create surplus. At the same time, you have to convert it into foreign currency in order to repay foreign debt. Now, that is one side of the challenge. At the same time, given the large debt servicing burden, government hands are virtually tied when it comes to implementing investment project. The huge non-tradable boom in the country after the civil war came mostly from government expenditure in massive infrastructure projects. Now, at the same time, we should not forget that the present government has a lot of other commitment to increase welfare expenditure and so on. When you take all these factors into account, we cannot expect much of rapid growth in non-tradable production. In construction, government services, and other related non-tradable activities are not going to have growth potential within the next 3 to even 10 years because of the huge debt problem. Therefore, growth has to come primarily from the expansion of tradable production, both export-oriented production as well as efficient import substitution production. Here I emphasize the term efficient simply because artificially imposing tariff barriers, if you promote domestic industry, it is going to be a huge burden to the country, like what happened in the 70s in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka during the 70s, the biggest constraint of manufacturing expansion of lack of foreign exchange, right? The industries had been promoted through draconian trade controls. That is not the way to do. We have to promote import substitution industry in an internationally competitive manner. If you do that, it would be equally important for addressing the imbalance in the economy in terms of this massive non-tradable bias. Now, dealing with the twin challenge, which is payment problem and the transfer problem, while setting the economy on a sustainable growth path require combining fiscal consolidation under the IMF program, which has been nicely discussed by the World Bank participant. I don't want to go into detail. The economy need to redress the anti-tradable bias, shifting the production structure from non-tradable to tradable production. This is the classical East Asian story. Then there is strong empirical evidence that macroeconomic stabilization without this composition shift in GDP can even result in economic stagnation. The government is expecting a 5 to 10% growth. It is impossible without redressing this structural imbalance in the economy. In the absence of significant improvement in the balance of payment position through the expansion of tradable production and limited room for further debt accumulation, which are already laden with debt, we can't borrow any more, then the only option for the government would be import compression. Import compression is going to kill domestic economic dynamism. Actually, there is plenty of example from other countries which succumbed to debt crisis in the 80s, early 80s. Many countries succumbed to debt crisis. And again, the East Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 98. Now, the debt crisis in the early 80s started with Mexico defaulting debt. There were about more than 20 countries had huge debt crisis. Out of these countries, only 2 countries recovered within 2 to 3 years. South Korea in Asia and Chile in South America, right? In both these countries, the driver of economic recovery was export orientation. And in Korea, the visionary economic reformer Kim Jae-ik came up with a huge structural adjustment program, the key element of which was export orientation, which was based on trade liberalization and, of course, supplemented with macroeconomic stabilization. In Chile, there was a visionary team of technocrats which restructured the economy towards a greater outward orientation. Other countries, some countries took 15 to 18 years to regain the pre-crisis growth dynamism. Again, a lot has been written about East Asian financial crisis, the rapid economic recovery of Thailand, Indonesia, and other Malaysia came from the traded good production sector. In other words, we need not only a production economy, as the government has been highlighting, trade-oriented production economy. A production economy within this tiny country is going to lead the outcome that we experience in the controlled regime during the 70s. I don't know whether I have got much time. I want to go through quickly through policy options. And this is a big topic, big subject. I'm going to make just a few points here. I must say that the government emphasis on cleaning the government is very important in this case, including cleaning the BOI and all that. But it itself, cleaning Sri Lanka is not going to be enough to come out of the crisis and to place the economy on a sustainable growth path. I'm going to discuss in brief the three pillars of economic success, which is based on my in-depth study of the East Asian growth miracle over the last 30, 40 years. Firstly, exchange rate policy. Real exchange rate, which is nominal bilateral exchange rate with trading partners adjusted for relative price, is the principal equilibrating variable of international trade and payments in an open economy. In the process of structural adjustment, exchange rate should continue to function not only as a shock absorber, that means to giving agility to the country to face external shock, but also to maintain international competitiveness of the economy. The key variable which measure international competitiveness, tradable production is the real exchange rate. In the exchange rate market operation, central banks should resist the early practice, which was the practice in Sri Lanka before the crisis, to use exchange rate as an instrument to tame domestic inflation. At the same time, I remember during Rajapaksa regime, one central bank governor said that it is important to keep the exchange rate overvalued so that dollar value of per capita income would be higher, then easy for us to become a middle income country. What a silly argument, right? We should avoid this type of rhetoric. Preventing real exchange rate appreciation, meaning maintaining international competitiveness of domestic tradable production, should be given priority over maintaining inflation target. Actually, now a lot of economists like Dani Rodri could argue that when a country tries to come out of a debt crisis, perhaps little bit inflation is not that dangerous. What is more important is in international competition. Before moving to the next point, I must say that the current exchange rate policy is in the correct direction. I must thank the central bank for that. But sometimes there is the possibility of central banks succumbing to the political pressure. It would be good for the country if the central bank can remain firm and continue with this good policy. Second, tariff reform. Mr. Sajjan and Indrajit, both of them highlighted importance of trade policy reform. Sri Lanka has a highly complicated import tariff structure. We have quantitative restriction on some items, then high and cascading tariff. Cascading means unnecessarily varying from very low to high tariff. As Professor Kuroda mentioned, it leads to high effective rate of protection, as our guru, Max Gordon, has taught us, right? And we have plethora of para tariff. during the Rajapaksa regime, when the government wanted to protect certain politically linked industries and all that, since you can't go against the IMF policy, they introduced different tariffs under different names. They are what we call para tariff. Now, this high tariff structure, cascading tariff, lead to corrupt custom practices. Think about the HS-based tariff list. At 4-digit product level, there are many 6-digit product levels. When the tariff rate vary dramatically, importers can bribe the custom officers and shift from low tariff rate to high tariff rate. Actually, I had a long discussion 2 months ago with a very senior custom officer. She told me that this is happening in this country. Now, that's the revenue side manipulation. At the same time, it distorts the incentive structure faced by domestic producers. Therefore, it is important to convert quantitative restrictions and the plethora of all other tariffs into ad valorem tariff. That means percentage tariff, and reduce this tariff, I would say, to a moderate uniform level. You can define what moderate is, but what I am saying is that at this stage, significant dismantling of tariff, I am not going to advocate. It could jeopardize the reform process through relentless pressure on the foreign reserve position, and it could dramatically reduce government revenue. But there is substantial empirical evidence that suggests moderate uniform tariff level can increase government revenue. The incentive for manipulating tariff administration is reduced when the tariffs are relatively moderate. That means below the smuggler's cost margin. At one time, one of the very efficient custom directors did an estimate saying that tariff manipulation or trade deflection is not cost-free. The people who smuggle the product or bribe the custom officers, their cost is about 15%, right? Say, reducing the tariff to a level between 15% might reduce the incentives to do this manipulation, and it can increase tariff revenue. Now, all of you know that tariff is a tax on exporters as well, right? The famous Lerner symmetry theorem. Then what is the best, second best option? We are not in a position to dramatically cut tariff because of the two reasons I mentioned. The second best option for tilting the incentive structure in favor of export producer to revamp the existing duty rebate scheme and bonded warehouse scheme to provide export producers with duty-free access to intermediate imports within the overall moderate tariff structure. We have an overall tariff structure at a moderate level, but give opportunity for export producers to import intermediate good at world market price without tariff. Without that, export is not going to be competitive. This is why what I have learned by reading about export development strategy at the early stage in Taiwan and Korea. Lim Jae-ik work, I mean, he strongly advocates this policy because that is the way to till the incentive structure in favor of export producers. Finally, I'm going to take few minutes to discuss foreign investment regime. The experience from liberalization reform during since 1977 vividly illustrated the role of foreign investment in export promotion. Single export-oriented producer coming to Sri Lanka, named Martin Trust. I know you know his name. He is considered the father of our apparel industry. He came to the country after liberalization and set up a number of firms with Ashraf family and Amalian family that provided the base to make the country a very competitive center of high quality apparel production. This is the only story everybody knows, but at the same time, even though in a distorted policy regime with the civil war going on, number of new export lines came up in the country. And we became the biggest numeric tire producer in the world, heavy duty tire, based on our rubber production and so on. Even in the electronic sector, big firms like Motorola, Harris Corporation, who wanted to come to Sri Lanka, who registered manufacturing companies in this country, left because of the civil uprising. But as I'm going to show a little later, even in the electronic industry, we have a little dynamic component assembly industry in this country with significant participation of Japanese firms. I'm going to show that slide a little later. Then it is important to restore BOI to its original one-stop shop status. And BOI did wonders in the early 80s, particularly after early 1990 reforms, right? But we need to restore BOI to that status, and strict time-bound framework has to have for investment approval. When I study BOI records in 2017, I found many firms applications submitted to BOI had remained there for 2 years. When I asked officers there, they laughed in a way, and then basically that was the 10% regime, right? 10% approval regime. We had to eradicate those practices and make BOI an efficient investment approval and promotion institute with a strict time frame, like in the early 90s, to process investment application. Then grant tax concession only for export-oriented firms and a very stringent time-bound fashion. In Sri Lanka, some of the tax holidays 5 years, but eventually they have become 20 years, right? We have to avoid it. And again, I do not agree with the idea that we need to abolish all tax holidays, but we need tax holidays strictly focused on export-oriented investment. That is the practice everywhere, including Vietnam recently, right? Therefore, if you want to make Sri Lanka an investment center for export-oriented production, we can't completely abolish tax holidays. Then one important thing that we need to learn from other countries in the region is the importance of an overseas investment promotion campaign at the highest political level. If possible, engaging our visionary president, I think he has both charisma and the vision to sell the country. And we need to get the participation of successful export-oriented firm in our investment promotion campaign. In the past, particularly during the last 2 decades, investment promotion campaigns were done by administrators and I would say some lawyers. The prime motive for them was that it was a shopping trip, right? Not promoting investment. Then prime focus of the investment promotion campaign should be to integrate domestic export-oriented manufacturing to global manufacturing value chain, GMVC, which now account for more than 60% of world manufacturing trade. Many policymakers talk about producing goods from the beginning to end within our domestic economy and exporting. But these type of products have gone out of the window. If you want to be export oriented, you had to specialize in part and component and final assembly within the global manufacturing value chain. And according to my estimate, these type of products account for 2/3 of world manufacturing trade, while ignoring that segment simply because talking about a dream of production economy to produce everything from beginning to in the country is going to be a dead-end activity. Despite early promises in the aftermath of the liberalization reform in Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka failed to attract large GMEC manufacturing companies to the country to set up production bases, mainly because of the country risk created by the civil war. McDonnell Douglas, the vice chairman of Motorola, who came to open up the factory in Katunayaka, in his open statement, he said the first and foremost priority for us when we come to a country is the political stability. And we lost political stability in the early 80s and Motorola left the country. But fortunately, we have political stability and a strong government. But a strong government has to have a clear, correct vision, not talking simply about producing within the national boundaries of these tiny countries. However, even though we lost the opportunity to attract big multinational, there is evidence that Sri Lanka has potential to regain lost ground through a well-designed investment campaign. I have written in detail in a paper recently published. Since there are a number of high-profile Japanese participants in the forum, I want to show this data. In 2016, I interviewed 10 firms engaged in electronic assembly. Then this year, when I visited Sri Lanka, I made telephone calls and did a web search, and then I found that all these 10 firms are still present in Sri Lanka. Not only that, they have expanded their production massively. To give you an example, FDK Lanka, which is a Japanese Sri Lanka joint venture, actually that's a beautifully written case study of this in JICA website. This company in 2017 60s had 686 workers. Now it has 2,600 workers. Then Sri Lanka, another Japanese company, has increased employment from 250 to 300. Lanka Harnesses, a well-known company providing component to Toyota, Lamborghini, and all the prominent automotive companies in the world. At that time, they are employing 330. Now it has increased to 1,200. And the manager told me, you won't believe, annual sales turnover is $83 million of that company. Then you can see this Okaya Electric. Again, the production has expanded. And there is a new company in Kadawata. Again, you won't believe, it is producing component for Airbus and Boeing. This company, employment at that time when I visited was 90, but they have a plan to increase employment within few years to 2,000. And like that, you can have a look at this data. When I interview these firms, what they say is that our the workers operate in these firms are world class, very easy to train. And then some firms say that eye-hand combination, what is the ability to link eyesight and hand dexterity, which is very important in electronic assembly. Our girls are second to none in the world. That's why what these companies told me. And then, then I have discussed 3 pillars of this strategy. Firstly, exchange rate policy. We are in the correct direction now, but we need significant reform related to trade regime and the foreign investment regime. I want to say a fourth factor. Since the government is very strong now, 2/3 majority, and again JVP, the core of the party, was directly involved in trade unions, I think government need to have a good agreement with the trade unions to convince investors that there won't be a lot of industrial disruptions through trade union activities. To give you 2 examples, in the mid-90s, the biggest investor in our export-oriented manufacturing, you can guess it was Korea, right? It was the biggest. Then all the Korean firms in export-oriented factories left Sri Lanka because of trade union agitation. And a friend of mine at Seoul University, studying about foreign direct investment in Sri Lanka, said no foreign Korean investor would come to Sri Lanka to set up a factory unless there is strong commitment from the government to tame trade unions. My second example relates to Japanese firm. A Japanese subcontract to, I think it is contracted to another big electronic firm, which later renamed as Panasonic, right? They set up a factory in Vanatamulle as a joint venture with a Sri Lankan company to produce heads for video and audio products. It was employing 500 girls, and girls were very happy. Their salaries were much higher than salaries of apparel factory girls. But do you know what happened? Trade unionists intervened, and then the agitated the girls, and there were work stoppages and other disruptions, resulting in production disruption. Now, this company was producing these components for that. I think the company is Matsushita, right? Now, Matsushita production is based on just-in-time production pattern. Then, if there is disruption in component supply, the production run cannot be done smoothly. Therefore, Japanese partner withdrew. Then 500 girls lost employment opportunities. Therefore, my strong request for the government, with your mandate and with your relationship with trade union, you are in a good position to avoid these type of calamities in our industrial sphere. Then, just quick point, the reforms I discuss will work with a time lag. You can reorganize the BOI, bring foreign investor, give more incentive to export. All these are not going to have instantaneous impact. Therefore, since there is diplomatic community participants here, I would like to say that there is strong case for harnessing external support, resources, low interest, long-term loans as budgetary support is very important in Sri Lanka at this stage. The best example I can come up with, Indonesia in the mid-60s, right? Under Sukarno regime, country got into a huge debt problem. Then in the mid-60s, under Suharto regime, government embarked on a massive structural adjustment reform. And Japan played the pivotal role. Japan concessionary aid and investment support helped Indonesia to come out of the crisis. I hope in this time, as a good friend and our best bilateral donor, Japan can come to our help. Then finally, I'm going to have some concluding remarks. The unprecedented foreign debt crisis in Sri Lanka was the outcome of perennial vulnerability of the economy to external shock that was compounded by structural anti-tradable bias in the economy rooted in the debt-driven development strategy during the post-Civil War era and policy reversions during that period. Not only debt-driven strategy, the government distorted the incentive regime through intervention in the tariff regime, making the BOI utterly corrupt, right? That's why we succumbed to the crisis. Sri Lanka's policy challenge is to take the unprecedented economic crisis as the springboard for lifting the country onto a sustainable, outward-oriented growth path. Outward-oriented production economy, not simply a production economy, which is a dead end. This requires combining IMF standard stabilization package with coherent structural adjustment reform to redress the anti-tradable bias to create an outward-oriented economy. Finally, 2 points for discussion. This can be controversial. Election campaign always use as a slogan, 75 years of lost year. Please get rid of that slogan. We must study the present in the light of the past for the purpose of the future. We need to ignore, ignoring the lessons from both failures and achievements of Sri Lanka during the past 77 decades would be a costly mistake. We did a lot of mistakes until 77, utterly controlled regime. There was some achievement from the liberalization reform. We should not forget about them. Entire 70, we can't start from a blank sheet. Then the anti-neoliberal economic slogan nowadays voiced in the current policy debate and even in the parliament, I heard this voice very loudly, could unnecessarily hinder the government's attempt to engage private sector, including foreign investors, in rebuilding the economy. So these people do not understand what neoliberal economy. Now, the neoliberal clique created by Milton Friedman and Hayek, called Montpellieran society, is virtually dead. The last strong man in the team, Gary Becker, died in 2014, right? Now, but some economists who are cited in this debate, like Harjun Chen, they use neoliberal economics in a misleading way to attack trade liberalization and investment promotion. They are the key to develop this country. If you look at the Southeast Asian experience, look at what is happening in Vietnam. Vietnam does not use this useless anti-neoliberal economic slogan. I have supervised 5 PhD students from Vietnam. When I tell this debate to them, they laugh. That is not the way Vietnam developed. Vietnam gradually moved away from private sector activity and tried to promote foreign direct investment and trade in a very visible, concerted way. That is the development success. I would like to hear more from the audience on these 2 points. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to me. If I have taken long time, please forgive me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. That was Professor Premachandra Atukovala, our lead presenter, who made an extensive presentation on the subject. Our next item is question and answer session. But before that, I think we have a little bit of time to spare to enable Dr. Kumaraswamy to say a few words with regard to what has been discussed during the course of this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first, thank all our speakers. I think we've been very fortunate in listening to a very rich list of presentations. Some very profound insights have come out. And I thought, by way of complementing what has been said in these presentations, just to share some thoughts that have quickly come to my mind. There seems to be consensus that Sri Lanka has done extremely well in stabilizing the economy. From where it was 2 years ago to where we are now, all the macro indicators have improved much more quickly and better than anybody expected. However, there is also consensus that we are still a long way away from creating a kind of sustainable growth model based on an outward-looking competitive economy. There is a lot to do on that front. So I think those 2 conclusions came out in all the presentations. The second thing is on these structural reforms, I was seconded from the central bank to the finance ministry in the 1980s and became the finance minister, the late Mr. DeMille's bag carrier. And I used to go around listening to him, making his speeches. And the structural reforms that he spoke about at that time are exactly what we're talking about today. So over the last 45 years or so, we have not been able to do these reforms. The reforms related to the factor market, the reform related to the investment climate, the reform related to the trade regime and trade promotion, education, training skills, all these things we talk about today were being talked about by him in the 1980s. Why is it that we haven't been able to do it? I would suggest two reasons. One is these reforms tend to have a relatively long gestation period. And governments are not keen on reforms that don't give a quick payback. And that tends to be a disincentive. But more than that, the structural reforms, while they benefit many, also there are losers, particularly those with vested interests in the system. And they tend to block these reforms. And in Sri Lanka, given the nature of our politics, the nexus between various interest groups and the governments of the day, and all governments of all parties, it has played itself out in such a way that reform became almost impossible, because the vested interests were able to always block it. And the vested interests ranged from businessmen who had business interests to the trade unions, for instance, digitalization in the IRD and customs, for instance, has to a large extent been blocked by the trade union. So there are various interest groups who have been blocking, and often, businesses looking after their own interests. Now, this government, given the fact that it doesn't carry the same baggage that previous governments have done, and which is aggressively trying to move away from the type of politics and the nexus between politics and economics we've had in the past, I hope now has a better chance of undertaking some of these reforms, because they tend to be, they seem, so the moment they seem to be much more data-driven and are objective in terms of how they proceed. And that was demonstrated in the way they have really progressed in terms of the IMF program, the debt restructuring, etc., where they've been very pragmatic. I mean, they have fine-tuned the program, IMF program, for instance, to look after the middle-income groups and the low-income groups through the assessment program, through tax adjustments, etc., which is perfectly legitimate given their mandate. But they have stuck to the overall framework. And despite their very strong mandate, a national mandate at that, in a country which has various fault lines, they've been able to transcend some of those fault lines. And in a way that I never expected to see in my lifetime, despite having that strong mandate, they didn't feel obliged to come and have mass policy reversal as we've had in the past. So that is to their great credit. And I hope we can move forward in the same spirit. Georg, in his excellent presentation, gave us a list of things that we need to do. And so there's no need for me to repeat any of that. But on revenue mobilization, I'd like to point out that, the numbers quoted were 8% of GDP in 2022. Now we're up to 11.9. Well, up to 1997, every year Sri Lanka collected more than 20% of GDP as revenue.
Yeah.
And now the reason why that has fallen away, one is quite a lot of that revenue was collected from the tree crop sector, that is tea, rubber, and coconut. But we no longer have the surpluses in that sector to be able to tax. So that has gone away. But the new sectors which have come in are not taxed. Apparel, people, tourism, the various sectors which are new have not paid tax. Which is why now, I mean, I must say, while I agree with everything that Premachandra usually says, I'm a great fan of this. But this, on tax incentives, I feel it's better to have investment incentives, investment allowances up front and link them to capital formation. But once a company starts making profits, that it should pay tax. I agree. Yeah. So that's the way we need to go. And I think Georg said 3% of GDP has been lost due to these tax concessions. So we need to reconsider that. And really, if we are only going to collect 15% of GDP as revenue, then we have a revenue expenditure ceiling of 13% of GDP. That is primary expenditure. Expenditure minus interest payments, that now the ceiling is 13%. That is a very tight ceiling. So we have to collect more than 15% of GDP. And we can. We can. You know, the people who have broad shoulders in this society still are not paying enough tax, in my view. There has to be more tax that has to be paid by the wealthy in this country. If we are to kind of protect the health and education, etc., which has given us a vaunted reputation in terms of social development, well, if we want to protect that, and if we are to have a society that is aligned with the cultural values of this country, then, you know, the wealthy need to pay more tax in this country. There's no two ways about it. And we can collect more than 15% of GDP. The third thing is, you know, trade, investment, that whole kind of space where a lot needs to be done. And we heard lots of very interesting things. I just want to make 2 points. As Sri Lankans, our DNA is such that we are very wary of opening up to the rest of the world. That is deeply embedded in our psyche for some reason. Even though historically, you look back millennia, we've been a trading hub in the middle of the Indian Ocean. But today, we are scared of the rest of the world. But just in terms of integration, which is the main theme of this seminar, I'd like to make 1 point. Just look at China's experience. Look at the experience of the coastal areas and look at the experience of the hinterland. The coastal areas are integrated with the global economy and have performed far, far better than that, which is not integrated or less integrated. So that in itself demonstrates the potential value of integration with the global economy and have the right kind of trade and investment policies that supports that. The other thing I wanted to say was the debt, Pathfinder was absolutely right. We have a solvency problem, right? Not a liquidity problem. So this time around, But let me just say one thing about the genesis of the debt problem. As a low-income country, we liberalized our economy in 1977. And we were the first country after Chile of those countries that went down the inward-looking path to liberalize our economy. So the traditional donors, including Japan, were extremely generous. They were keen to demonstrate good development outcomes in a country with a liberal polity and a liberal economy. So we got very generous amounts of aid, highly concessional, 60% from the concessional windows from the World Bank and the ADB, Japan and the other bilateral donors. For instance, we built the whole of the Victoria Dam on a grant from the UK government. So this was the kind of capital infusion that was coming in, and we got used to that. So every year, the World Bank used to organize a donor consortium meeting, and the donors pledged money to fill the external financing gap. When that gap was unsustainable, we were sent off the IMF to undertake some adjustment. But the adjustment was manageable, and so we kept going on. So the kind of we went 15, 16 times, but it was a manageable scenario. But then from our first international sovereign bond was issued in 2007. And by 2010, we had become a middle-income country, and we were no longer eligible for concessional money. And so instead of going to the aid group meeting every year and getting the pledges to fill our external financing gap, we issued international sovereign bonds of 2 billion, 2.5 billion every year to fill that external financing gap. Because we didn't adjust our behavior to the new reality of not being eligible for highly concessional money. Instead, we were subjected to rating agencies, international capital markets, and all the discipline that came with that. But we didn't adjust to that new paradigm. We did not adjust our behavior. And so by 2017, 2018, it was quite clear we were on a collision course with a very bad ending. But some measures were taken. There was the Medium-Term Debt Management Strategy and Active Liability Management Act. There was also efforts made to shift instruments, etc., for the longer term and cheaper ones. All that was being done, but then we had a 100% policy reversal when all that was set aside. So where I say it's a great credit of this government that they have not undertaken that kind of disruption and have kept things. Finally, let me just say this on Japan and investment. We saw some interesting investments, which Premachandra shared with us. But in 1983, I was seconded from the central bank to the finance ministry, the bank carrier there, as I said. Ambassador Chiba, who was the Japanese ambassador at the time in Colombo, had a meeting with the finance minister, Mr. Dimal, and he said that after the Plaza and Louvre Accords of the G7, when Japan then was compelled to revalue the yen significantly, a policy decision was taken in Tokyo to export capital. And he told the finance minister that 4 countries had been chosen as investment platform. Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. And a few months after that meeting, Akaidonan bought 35 Japanese businessmen. We had been told that however friendly Japan was towards Sri Lanka, however grateful it was to President Jayawardena and his speech in San Francisco, and no investment would come until a Japanese bank opened up in Sri Lanka. And the ambassador told the minister that 2 banks, Bank of Tokyo and Mitsubishi Bank, which have now merged, would be applying for licenses at that time. And that group, 35 businessmen came from Japan, came to Sri Lanka on the first day of their visit. So now remember, now banks are opening, 34 Japanese businessmen brought back, I don't know. The first day had a big meeting organized at the BMICH, and all the big beasts of the UNP government of that time were lined up. At 10:30, the whole thing was aborted. The businessmen were taken back to their hotel, the Oberoi as it was then, and from the top of the Oberoi, they saw Petra up in flames. This was 1983. And they got on a plane, went, and no investment came. And you think of what happened in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand in those years, in the 80s, in terms of Japanese investment. That is what we miss. Premachandra rightly mentioned Harris Corporation and Motorola. They went to Penang, I think. And you see what happened to electronics in Penang. These are all opportunities lost by us. So why I'm saying this, I said the importance of political stability and also of politics which takes divisiveness out of our society, which is what this government so far has done, and it is to its great credit, and I hope it will continue to do so. That's a big, big plus. And its campaign to end the vulnerability to corruption, if they are able to implement it, that will also be a big plus. Because corruption is an implicit tax on development. It hinders development. And now lots of developed countries have their own laws where they can get prosecuted for giving bribes. So unless that's cleaned up, it'll be very difficult to get that feeling. So lots of things with potential, we need to press ahead. But more than anything, we have to have a laser-like focus on developing this new growth model, which is based on, as Premachandra advocated very convincingly, based on the tradable sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kumaraswamy, for that intervention.
Do you want to give me a few minutes to respond to Indrajit?
Yes. Let me explain. We have about 25 minutes. We have a question and answer session, then closing remarks by Ambassador Obo. With that in mind, I can maybe about 2-3 minutes if you have something to you can.
Thank you very much, Indrajit, for your comment. They are highly complimentary. Always we agree with all these points. And I am in the process of writing a book for Oxford University Press on this. I will incorporate your comments with a big footnotes. But let me make few points. Relating to tariff reform, actually, you said the tariff to GDP income, government income to tariff revenue to government revenue ratio is 20%, which is correct.
Total revenue,
Until 70s.
yeah, total revenue to GDP.
Total 20%. It is correct. Actually, I want to make a clarification. Most of the tariff came from trade taxes, import duties and export duties. Actually, as part of the liberalization process, we removed export duties in 1994 and reduced import duty. Export duties removed, import duties declined. But to compensate for that, the government did not expand the domestic tax base. That was the reason why now the rate has declined to historically low level. Then second point you make is that fear about liberalization. This is partly because we have not educated the average public. Actually, now people always say that 77 reform was a mistake, right? But it brought a lot of gains to the country. Why 76, say, tariff reform was done overnight by the JR government at that time. And Deepak Lal, who was the advisor to the government at that time, told me Ronnie the Mill was the most efficient and knowledgeable finance minister he has seen in the world, right? In the developing world. He did this thing overnight, dramatic tariff reform. Then the gains turn out to be visible shortly. Therefore, people were happy about liberalization reform. I think we need strong government hand to do this and then convince the voters based on the outcome of the reform and then educate people without telling nonsense stories like liberalization killed this country. I think that's the important point. Debt issue you discussed nicely. Actually, we had concessionary foreign financing coming into the country in the until late 80s or 90s. Then we unnecessarily resort to borrowing at the private capital market. And again, the China factor is very important here. Now China has learned the lesson, but China's non-conditional loans encourage government to borrow massively. Now China is repenting, thinking about this mistake. Again, to your credit, I want to say something. In the parliament recently said that during your time at the central bank, your name was mentioned, didn't mention, but the government made 2 bond issues. But these bond issues were made simply because in order to prepare for debt repayment, right? Otherwise, you did not have intentions to waste them on investment projects or anything, right? And I think I tell this as a credit to you. I mean, during that period, you raised 2 big loans, but these loans were basically to prepare for impending debt repayments, right?
Yeah, if I can just clarify that, in Verite have done a study that during the period 2015 to 19, 89% of the borrowing went towards debt servicing.
Yeah, that's right.
World Bank actually said that actually I think 1 year they did, I think 2017 or 18, in the development update, they said 90% of the money we were borrowing was actually to service debt. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think you have to tell this with the big, because a lot of
people, I think we need to.
I'll stop at that point. Thank you so much for your very, excellent comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have very limited time for the question and answer session. I guess we have a couple of questions already. How do we proceed?
Okay, the first one is the first one. I think if I've understood it correctly, there is no, I've tried to say at the outset that there are two problems, basically.
Yeah.
One is the macro mismanagement,
Yeah,
and the second is this inability to have a tradables-driven growth.
exactly. I fully agree.
So there are those two issues.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's not just, so I don't know that you call it a fault of government or a fault of statecraft, but those are the two problems. And,
Yeah.
and successive governments were not able to resolve them.
Yeah.
And now we have no choice, we have to resolve them. Because otherwise we would go for another debt restructuring, and the poverty that has increased will not come down. So now we have no choice but to, this time around.
Yeah. No. Macro stabilization is a must. Actually, in my first slide, last sentence, I said we need to stabilize and then do structural adjustment. And then I focus on the latter part, because you and the World Bank representative talk about the macro side.
Okay.
Can someone read the next question before we answer?
Yeah, I think the first question is, the distinguished panelists, first question is, Sri Lanka, from Tusita Jayaratna, Sri Lanka's economic instability is a macro management failure as per the former governor. Is it government failure or fault of statecraft?
So that's one we just dealt with.
Yeah, I think that was already addressed. Second, next question from the Mr. Rashan Kulatunga. I'm commander of Rashan Kulatunga, retired. I would like to inquire if you have come across any policy preparation related to the blue economy and its potential opportunity introduced by the current government. As an island nation, it is crucial that we do not overlook this important area. I believe that the absence of comprehensive maritime policy and dedicated maritime spatial planning may be our inability to effectively harness maritime resources to grow economy. Your insight on this matter would be greatly appreciated. Who would like to respond, please?
I can say a few things, but maybe Indrajit want to say something.
No, this is not an area. I mean, I think the Mr. Kulatunga has to be right. There's enormous potential, but I just am not knowledgeable enough how best to how to utilize, how to exploit that.
Yeah. Let me add a point. At the beginning, when I talked in my presentation, I said export orientation does not necessarily mean promoting manufacturing export. Agriculture sector is even more important simply because of the rural base on the agricultural sector. If you look at the Thailand experience, out of Thailand export, a significant share is processed food export. Now, this processed food export creates a lot of jobs in the rural economy because of the link, right? Then in Sri Lanka, seafood industry has a lot of potential in Jaffna area, Batticaloa, not only sea, but also inland fisheries. To give you an example, in 2005, I was involved in a major study in Vietnam about export promotion. And based on the Chilean experience, actually Chile is a significant processed food exporter, including fish product. I made this point, even the Minister of Industry was there in the meeting. He said this is a primary industry, but I said it is not a primary industry. Seafood is one of the most dynamic export product in the world. Look at Chile, they are doing very well. Actually, I'm not trying to get credit for that. Seafood export became a major emphasis on Vietnam. Even though we talk about manufactured goods, Vietnam has become a major seafood exporter. But to do that, you have to invest foreign investors. Then CP Group, the biggest food multinational in Asia, is involved in Vietnam. And simply because we have to meet SPS standards, health standards, in order to be a good exporting country. For that, you need foreign investors coming into the country. Actually, one of the officers in Australian Sri Lanka High Commission encouraged a big food trader to come to Sri Lanka. That company had 2 billion turnover. He loved the country. He traveled all over the country and he wanted to buy seafood. But the problem was there's no scale to meet his requirement. He said, without a big foreign company come to the country and then get engaged in the seafood exporting, I can't come to this country. I think this is an area we need a lot of emphasis.
Thank you, Professor Chandra. Next interesting question from Mr. Kulatunga Rajapaksha. His question, I will just quickly read it. Exporters need to pay income tax if they make profit. It is unfair to grant them tax relief as we need to treat dollar earn is equal to dollar save. So need to be fair by farmers who save dollars. Further, there are companies whose revenues come from local and export sales. Hence, exemptions. That's the question. Exemption. Expose. Profit
when I use the term export-oriented.
Your proposal, export rebate, if granted, can suggest to exempt that component from the income tax.
Bit complicated question, but one thing I want to say that if you want to attract export-oriented firm, we have to give incentives similar to that in other countries. I mean, I have been studying Penang Development Corporation. Now, Penang is a very well-developed export hub, but still they give incentives. Say, in order to bring Intel Corporation to Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam government gave a lot of incentives, simply because when a big firm comes to the country, others follow. If you want to make the country export hub, I think I know this issue, moral problem, but we can't be an isolated investment center. We have to match incentives with other countries. Giving limited tax incentives for few years does not mean that we are not going to tax them. Say, most of the export-oriented firms like Mars, Branding, they pay huge amount of tax. But I'm talking about the formative stage. We need to help it is good that if we can bring them without giving incentives, but you can't do it, unfortunately.
Thank you, Chandra. But to my knowledge, any incentives contingent upon export performance is no longer available for the country like Sri Lanka. It is a WTO violation. Anyway, that's my just comment. Quickly, I go to the next one from Tusita Jayaratna. For Mr. Kamoshida Naoki, I joined a roundtable discussion in 2023 when Japanese Deputy Trade Minister visited, which was held at Ambassador's residence. There I asked, why not big investment to Sri Lanka by Japan? Then answer was political instability. Change policies and long-term security for the investors. What would be the present state of Japanese government for big investment do you think that security is sustainable in the country for large investment? Mr. Kamashoda, Naoki, could you please respond to that, please? Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Well, I think the Japanese investors are still waiting and seeing what the new government's policy will be. And it is, I think, well, that the government has the new government has a clear majority. So it is one encouraging sign, and also another encouraging sign that they are continuing the IMF program. But still, we need to see if sound macroeconomic policy will be in place, and also whether other reforms will get through. I think, but for the Japanese investors' mind, I think they are still seeing this country as a country that in debt default. Of course, the debt restructuring negotiations are ongoing, and we are seeing progress, but the process is not finished yet. And also another point is, well, as in the professor's slide, and there are just some Japanese companies doing well, and and also, so I think there are chances for Japanese companies to invest in this country. But still, it is also true that many companies experience difficulties in for example, and not in transparent procedures, delays in customs clearance, and also sudden changes in policy. So it is important for improved business climate that is conducive to investment. I hope that new government will first achieve macroeconomic stability and finish successfully the debt negotiations, and then improve the investment climate so that Japanese companies will feel secure to make a long-term investment in this country.
Thank you, Kamoshida Shan. There are another two questions. One is directed to Professor Premachandra, other one is for Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy from Nisi Solomon. First one to Professor Premachandra. With the anticipated shift away from Sri Lanka's anti-trade bias, what does India-Sri Lanka trade relation look like? How can the bilateral trade be enhanced? Professor Premachandra.
It is a big question, but I'm not a big fan of FTAs. There is no evidence to suggest that FTAs promote foreign investment and exports of a tiny country like Sri Lanka. Look at the FTA with India. India has become the biggest trading partner. Our exports are tiny, simply because the production structures of the two countries, our comparative advantage is not different. Economists say there is no trade complementarity. That is the same point apply with Bangladesh. What can you export to Bangladesh? Can you export ready-made garment or anything? So is the case with Thailand. A former student of mine, now a professor at Thomas Arts University, has written an article about Sri Lanka FTA with Thailand. He says Sri Lanka is not going to gain that much, right? So if we can have an FTA with the US, of course, we can have a significant gain because our ready-made garment exporters paid 50%, 15% duty to enter the market. Even the EU market, we have done tariff concession. The basic lesson from Singapore, Albert Winsemius, the advisor who made Singapore virtually to Lee Kuan Yew, he said, Prime Minister, don't worry about links with your poor neighbors. Have link with the big trading nations where you have trade complementarity. But I think in Sri Lanka, of course, we have, because of political reason, we can't ignore India. We have to promote trade. That I don't disagree with that. But placing too much emphasis on FTA is just wasting time.
Thank you, Professor Chanda. Next question to Dr. Kumaraswamy is, can I read it?
Yeah, please.
How effective is Sri Lanka's inflation targeting monetary policy in achieving its objectives, and what mechanisms are taken to safeguard, insulate itself from government influence? Professor.
Okay, thank you. Before I answer that question, may I just make a quick observation on the previous one?
Yes, please.
On
Yes,
India
yeah.
bilateral relation. But I think rather than focusing just on FTAs, we need to look at the whole relationship. We have a $4 trillion economy at our doorstep. And if you look at what happened to East and Southeast Asia when first Japan and then China had their growth surges, all the countries in those sub-regions benefited. Now, India is expected to grow, some people say 6%, others say 8%, but Southern probably growing in double digits. And as I said, it's $4 trillion. So there have to be opportunities. There have to be opportunities.
True, but we don't have an FTA. We don't need an FTA to do that.
Our private sector companies should be much more aggressive in terms of getting and India needs to walk the talk in terms of neighborhood first and making, they need to walk the talk on that. And we need to be much more agile and aggressive in terms of taking advantage of this $4 trillion market on our doorstep. To answer the question, which I should be answering, actually, flexible inflation targeting has been very successful. Flexible inflation targeting did not start with this IMF program. Flexible inflation targeting has been in place for about 15 years. We started going down that road. We put in place the framework that's needed. If you look at inflation from 2019, before everything changed with the new approach and homegrown policies, before that, if you look back more than a decade, we've had single-digit inflation. And because flexible inflation targeting, as I said before, I think it's data-driven, it's forward-looking. The central bank has strengthened its modeling and forecasting capabilities, and it is now doing pretty well, doing very well, in fact. I think the governor and his team need to be given a great deal of credit for the way they've managed inflation. After everything was kind of turned upside down during this homegrown policy phase. So it had, I suggest people who are interested in the subject look back at what has happened to inflation from 2019 backward. We had high inflation in the 2080s, in the 1980s. But then once we moved towards flexible inflation targeting, it has been in single digits, and the central bank has been getting better and better at it.
Thank you. There are two.
Can I make? I'm sorry, you probably don't see my hand. I don't know if you have a minute.
Oh, sorry.
Can I make a very quick reaction to the points on incentives, if time allows? If not, that's okay. I don't have to.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, so thank you. It's, previously, Professor mentioned about incentives to FDIs, right? And now we're talking about free trade agreements. Now, we look at the incentives that Sri Lanka has been giving in the last 20 years at least, and there is very little evidence that any of this was fostering investments, bringing cluster industry approaches, or broadly changing the perception of it. It might be an important added element, but I believe this is not the primary thing that investors are looking at. They are looking at rule of law, clarity, red tapes or absence of them, critical infrastructure skill base that they can work in. I mean, there are so many other critical elements. And yes, maybe in some cases, this comes as an add-on if you are competing, as you said, with other countries, maybe. So in a similar way, if you are looking at free trade agreements, Sri Lanka, you rightly said there might not be many, sort of complementarity when it comes to, say, Bangladesh, right? But look at GST plus with EU. So there is clear opportunity, and yet it's not being realized, right? There is incredible complementarity in terms of what Sri Lanka could have done, and it's not being utilized at all. So clearly, the matter is not in having this policy, is really in fostering the types of policies that encourage export-oriented industries. So I believe that, again, free trade agreements can be an important add-on, but only if industry is positioned to benefit from this. India is we still think about India in slightly, I think, a little bit in terms of different era. India has now so many segments of middle class and upper class consumers, and there are even for Sri Lanka major opportunities in niche areas for finding markets. But for that, first of all, these industries need to be grown in the country, and then only then they can benefit. Over.
Thank you very much. Last two questions. Ambassador Pamela Dean, will this view be communicated to the policymakers, especially to the president as the finance minister? Maybe Ambassador Gunatilaka can respond to that later. The Nalin, Colonel Nalin Hera, dear sir, can you define export and import scenario based on Marshall-Lerner condition, based on present export-import condition, and how it impact to increase the primary account balance? Professor, quickly, response required, please.
Yeah, too many questions now.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good question, but I must say, with due respect, he has not understood Marshall-Lerner condition. He has not understood Marshall-Lerner condition. Marshall-Lerner condition is simply says that import duty is virtually indirectly a tax on exporter at general level. Then you can't apply it to individual industries. Yeah. And actually, the comments by Mr. Sagat Young, I fully agree with this. Investment promotion policy has to be a package. What I am saying is that you can't ignore tax concession as an element of the package, particularly when you start to gain access to foreign direct investment markets. And Vietnam used incentives together with, of course, other reforms to attract foreign direct investment to the country in a big way. I know there are negotiations with Samsung. Eventually, Samsung shifted the entire production base from China to Vietnam, Hanoi, and the incentives were a key element, not the only element in it. And again, I fully agree with his comment about FTAs, they can play a role. But given our administrative capacity and lack of qualified people to get in negotiations, we need to focus more on supply side policies before arranging trips to various countries to negotiate FTAs. They like it, right? Having a trip to somewhere in business class. That shouldn't be the way to do it.
And under this question and answer session, next is the closing remarks. It will be by Ambassador Nobuhito Obo, former ambassador of Japan in Sri Lanka, who is also currently with TRIPS Alliance. He has been very helpful in putting this webinar together. I would like to give the floor to him. And now, before that, answer to the previous question, Pathfinder Foundation usually shares its reports and the proceedings with the government institutions. And in this particular instance also, it is our intention to do the same. Professor Obo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's my best pleasure and honor to say a few words. I'm really pleased in listening to very incited and relevant discussions. And I'm grateful to Professor Kuroda sharing his busy time for this webinar, and also Professor Brahmachandra Tukora Ala, and also Mr. Kamoshida from Embassy of Japan, and particularly I'm grateful to see Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy. We start discussion about the Sri Lankan economy before the crisis, and we made a quick recommendation to the government. The crisis was very much possible to avoid, and it was very sad to see that crisis, but it's amazing to see quick recovery from that magnitude of crisis in Sri Lanka. And now you have a very strong government, president, and parliament as well. And I'm really convinced about the discussions, all the opinion or directed to the subtitle of this webinar, charting the path for integration into the global economy. Yes, Sri Lanka, regional position is very unique and beneficial. I had Japanese Business Association in Colombo started exchange with Japanese Business Association in Chennai. They have enough reason. Starting last year, I had. That's very good sign. They, definitely eyeing possibility to connect Colombo and Chennai various ways, and thinking about the potential possibility to invest in somewhere around. Just now, as Mr. Kamoshida said, they're wait and see position, but once it's guaranteed or convinced, they will start investment again. I do believe so. And I myself may visit Sri Lanka with Japanese investor in this year sometime. So thank you very much, Pathfinder Foundation, for organizing this webinar, and I'm really impressed all the discussions, delivery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Obo. Thank you very much indeed. We have practically come to the end of our program today. I'm sure our executive director of the Pathfinder Foundation, Dr. Dayaratna Silva, wishes to say a few words.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, esteemed speakers, and dear participants. As we bring this insightful session to a close, on behalf of the Pathfinder Foundation and myself, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to our distinguished speakers for their comprehensive presentation and intervention, and most importantly, to all the participants for their active engagement. Your contributions have made this half-a-day session a resounding success. This is the first webinar organized by the Pathfinder Foundation in 2025. And it has exceeded, I would say, expectation with the overwhelming response we received from the government agencies, private sector, international community. The keen interest displayed underscores the significance of this timely policy-relevant discussion, most importantly, rich debate generated by our participants and the presenters. With regard to the key question, what are the nuances, understanding the challenges, the opportunities exist for Sri Lankan economic integration with the global, what policies? I think, just here that the new government will be presenting its budget middle of February. So I'm sure we will get greater clarity in policy direction after the budget. Before concluding, let me briefly, I wish to convey my heartfelt appreciation to Ambassador Hobo for his invaluable support in organizing this event, especially in connecting with us, Professor Kuroda. On behalf of the Pathfinder Foundation, I pay tribute to Professor Kuroda for his enlightened keynote address, which you amply, very eloquently applied 4-point agenda which is critical: increase in tax revenue, realistic exchange rate, liberal trade policies, etc. My sincere thanks go to Emeritus Professor Premachanda Atukora, my good friend, for his detailed presentation. Thank you for your excellent detailed presentation. You delved into root causes of Sri Lankan economic crisis and outlined what are the strategic policies required for new administration to navigate sustainable path forward beyond the IMF program, which is, I think you gave 3 agenda items on that. Furthermore, I extend my gratitude to Mr. Gavok, country manager for Sri Lanka and Maldives at the World Bank. You presented various important items: tariff reform, reducing the trade costs to trade facilitation, tax reform, most importantly, are vital. Mr. Kamoshida, Deputy Head of Mission, Embassy of Japan in Colombo, thank you very much for joining. I think you emphasized the very important point, that is the importance of the building trust among the international community, which is key to attract the foreign investment and, of course, integration into the global economy. Another point I think Mr. Gavak mentioned is this fiscal policy space for public investment is limited for Sri Lanka. Therefore, private sector promotion, motivation of private sector investment is key. Special note of thank you, Dr. Indrish Kumarasamy, for your gracious presence. Thank you for excellent moderation, for your insightful opening remarks, and also my chairman for insightful opening remarks made at the beginning. To our participants, once again, thank you for active engagement, thoughtful questions, which enriched today's discussion. And this concludes the proceedings of this important session. Thank you.